there was no hiding. You know, when I came out at 16 to myself and my friends, it was to the shock of 0 people. I mean, I had friends telling me I was gay. I had friends' parents telling me I was gay.
So usually on Lost Spaces, which by the way, if you're new here, you've never listened to this show before, my name's Kay Anderson and this is Lost Spaces, the podcast that is all about lost queer spaces and the memories of the people who went there. Really, it's a show about queerness and how queerness is ignited. Oh, I like that. How queerness is ignited by access to queer spaces and how my guests have navigated that. Anyway, usually on Lost Spaces, we talk about a bar or a club or a coffee shop or, you know, some kind of physical building-y type thing. But this week, we are doing something slightly different and talking about a set of steps. Yep, you heard me correctly. We are talking about a set of steps, but they aren't just any set of steps. I've said set of steps quite a lot. They aren't just any set of steps. They are the legendary and imaginatively titled steps that were found in Toronto's gay village. And to tell us all about the steps is the author, public speaker, and DEI specialist, Michael Bach, who may have recently escaped the cold, cold winters of Canada to live in Palm Springs, California, but nonetheless maintains that a huge piece of his heart belongs to Toronto's gay village, where he got to I'm not going to say that. He got to find himself and explore his queerness. In this conversation, we talk about coming out before you even really have a clear concept of what gay even is, using your fake ID to try and get into the club and having middling success with that, and what it's like to navigate being queer at an all-boy boarding school. I think you probably already know how that conversation is going to go, right? Anyway, let's get into it. Okay, so you're going to have to treat me like I'm an idiot. Shouldn't be too hard to do. But I get the concept of the steps. But I also don't get it at all.
Okay, I appreciate that.
So what I understand about it is that it was a meeting place in the community. It was where people would go and hang out and meet. But I don't understand why they couldn't have gone and met somewhere else.
So that is a very astute observation. So the queer community in Toronto in the 1970s and 1980s grew up around a short block of Church Street. Mm-hmm. And it went from effectively in the North End, Isabella Street, down to about Alexander Street, which is maybe 1.5 kilometers or 2 kilometers, about a mile depending on what you speak. So small little community, very densely populated with apartment buildings. And as a community, we kind of gravitated towards that largely because there were queer bars and bathhouses had all sort of centered in that area. And a building was built, and I don't remember what year it was built. I want to say it was early 1980s. This building was built, and the front of the building had commercial real estate in it, a coffee shop and a photo shop and a bank on the corner, as I recall. But the city of Toronto is on an angle. So because, of course, at the south end of the city of Toronto is Lake Ontario, and everything goes north from there on a just slight incline. You don't really feel it, but the consequence of that is when they're building buildings, you can see that things are not exactly straight. So that was the case at the corner of Church and Wellesley. This building had steps to get into all of the retail shops there. And some of those steps were, small, and then others were quite large as you went south to make up for that angle.
Ah, okay.
So it was actually quite a large space where people could meet. It was also right in front of a coffee shop, which became a popular hangout. You'd go in, you'd get a coffee, you'd sit on the steps. There was a lot of cruising that went on, and it became a gathering point, particularly for young queer people in the 1980s. And it was really the center point of the community. It was like how would I describe it? Sort of like a beacon, like you knew you were in a safe place when you're at the steps. You could meet your friends there. You could hook up there. And people would say, oh, I'll meet you at the steps. And you knew exactly where you were. And I lived in the north part of the city with my family. And I remember coming down on the subway on the tube. And I'd get off at Wellesley Station. And the whole time I was tense. Because, of course, as a young queer person in the 1980s, not the best time for us. And I was not the butchest kid in the world. So it was pretty obvious that I was
a flamer.
Yeah. And I would get off at Wellesley and my shoulders would go down and I'd breathe and I'd feel relief and I'd walk the block over to Church Street and there would be my people. And there were lots of other places that people could meet, of course. Keeping in mind this is pre-internet, so of course there's no phones, there's no apps. We met people in bars. There was a local community center where you could meet people, and they did various classes and group meetings, that sort of thing. But then there was the steps, and the steps was that safe place where you could come and meet friends and new friends, and it was the center of the community.
So we still have some more practical questions about it, but I think that's maybe a little boring. So I'll slot those in later. Why don't we find out a little bit more about that not particularly butch little Michael who lived in the north of the city? What was the first inkling for you that you might not be heterosexual?
Oh, the first time I figured it out, I was 9.
I noticed the emphasis on I, so I will be asking about other people.
I figured you would. I was 9 years old. I was at Boyne River Science Camp.
Would you be like out of choice? Like you wanted to be there or you were forced to be there?
Oh, no, everybody went. Girl, this was not no.
A science
I did not go
camp.
to a science. Yeah, well, they would take classes. Your class would go up, and you'd be there for a week. It was like a mid-school.
So it wasn't like a summer thing.
No.
Okay. I will retract my judgment.
It's totally fine. Listen, I have to take off my pants to count to 11. So we were at Boyne River, and I was always friends with the girls, and I was talking with these girls, and I distinctly remember I had a crush on a boy, and I told my counselor that I had a crush on this boy and that I was gay. I don't think I fully grasped what that word meant. I just knew I had feelings for this boy. And that is sort of the first recollection. I will tell you, though, it did not end well.
Well, I was going to ask, so in this instance, is a counselor someone who's just a few years older than you? It's not like an actual adult.
She would have been, mid-teens.
Fuck.
Yeah. So she actually went and told the head of the camp, who went and told my teacher, who told my principal, who told my parents. And I ended up in therapy at the Hinks Institute. And I spent 6 months in therapy only to have the therapist come back to my parents and say, he doesn't exhibit any signs of homosexuality. Little did they know. Keeping in mind, this is 1980. So,
Sorry to laugh.
no, the therapist probably should have been disbarred at that point for just being incompetent. But yeah, I don't know what I was expecting to happen by uttering those words. I don't think it was therapy. But I was also so young, right? Like I didn't understand what was going on. There were no examples of what it meant to be an openly gay person.
But okay, in this chain of events of counselor to teacher to principal to parents, do you remember anyone talking to you about this?
No, it all happened behind closed doors. And, I left camp thinking everything was fine. And the next thing I knew, I was being forced to go to therapy.
And were you even told, like, the reason that you're going is because we think you might be a Mo and we want to, like, make sure that we stamp it out or...
No, not for years later. I had come out to my parents before I found out what had actually happened. But yeah, no, it was years later.
So you were just going to therapy, not really knowing, but kind of not questioning it because you were a kid and you were just doing what you were told.
Yeah, I also had faced a lot of bullying as a young person, immense bullying. So they kind of couched it in that.
Okay.
So I remember distinctly talking with a therapist a lot about my bullies. And so it never came out, oh, this 9-year-old is, are you a homosexual? Like there was never those questions.
Here's a doll. Where do you want to touch the doll? Yeah.
Exactly. If you had a girl doll or a boy doll. But in years, I mean, this is, decades ago. In retrospect, I now see what he was trying to achieve with his questions.
Yeah.
But at the time, I certainly had no awareness about it.
Maybe he said that you didn't exhibit any signs of homosexuality to protect you because he was just like, fuck, we need to just leave this kid alone.
He may have. It was an interesting time around the whole psychology of sexuality, if you think about it. And the Hinks Institute was not a regressive space. Like they had fully accepted that homosexuality had been removed from the DSM, whatever that stands for, being a mental illness in 1973, if I remember.
What does it stand for? Directory of Social and Medical? No,
I knew you were going to ask that as soon as I said
well,
it.
we'll find out. I'll paste it in later and make myself sound really smart.
Yeah, no, I can't remember. They weren't an organization that was promoting conversion therapy or anything. So there was never any concern about that. I don't know what signs of homosexuality look like other than things I won't say into a microphone at this point, but certainly
let the listener imagine.
Just go on Twitter. Gay Twitter has some signs of homosexuality. I don't know what he was looking for, but it was more for me. Those sessions allowed me to come out of my shell and to start to build some confidence and address some of the damage that had been done by decades of bullying at that point, or not decades, but years of bullying at that point.
But so it was kind of a good thing that it happened.
Yeah,
but
sure.
How did it feel when you found out later on that your parents had sent you to this?
I don't know that I really felt anything.
Oh, okay.
By the time it came out, I was early 20s and had come to terms with my own sexuality for the most part and recognized that who I was as a child, there was no hiding. When I came out at 16 to myself and my friends, it was to the shock of 0 people. I mean, I had friends telling me I was gay. I had friends' parents telling me I was gay.
How does that come up?
Well, I had a wonderful friend, Kat, who I was very close to. And her mother, she was a Brit and a raging alcoholic. So I think every time I saw her, she was in her cups. Ooh. And I was talking about a girl. We were going to some, school dance or something. And I was talking about how I liked her. And I I don't remember the exact transition into it, but she looked at me and said, "Darling, you're gay." And like fully, I'm sure she had a glass of wine, like Chardonnay in her hand or a martini or something. "Darling, you're gay." Just trying to get me to kind of come to my realization of my own, but I fought it still for a little while.
But what comes next after someone's parents say that to you? Like, okay, well, I think I gotta go.
What came was denial. "No, I'm not. I really like this girl, blah, blah," whatever. Again, context is important, I think. This was about 1985, 1986.
So being a raging drunk was acceptable then. So.
Only for the British. Only for the British.
Yeah, there's a panache there, isn't there? You can pull it off.
It is.
Yeah.
Good. Wonderful charm.
And so you came out to yourself and your friends at 16.
Yes.
Did you come out to your parents at that time as well?
I came out to my parents on my 19th birthday.
Aww.
Again, not a secret.
But they just had confirmation like 10 years ago from that psychotherapist.
They had a professional say that it was not the case. I was away at uni and we were on the phone and my father said they had heard my boyfriend's voice in the background.
Aww.
And I had told them I had a girlfriend and they heard a masculine sounding voice, although I'm going to put masculine in air quotes, remembering Robert. But they had heard his voice and my father finally said, "Your mother wanted to know if that's a girl. Are you gay?" I said, no, I'm straight, blah, blah, blah. Hung up the phone. 5 minutes later, I called back and I said, "Yeah, you're right. I'm gay." And I had a call later that evening with my mother and confirmed for her. And there were tears, lots of tears, and the usual comments, "Where did I go wrong?" and yada, yada. Oh, yeah.
From your mother?
From my mother, yeah. And she took it a lot harder than my dad did. And it wasn't, I was very angry at her at the time for how she reacted because my parents are very liberal, very left-leaning. They had queer employees. My father ran a company and had queer employees, in the 70s. So they knew. And all of their queer employees had said, "Your boy is gay."
How does that come up?
Well, because I was running around the shop. It was a printing shop.
Yeah, but when do they bring that up? In supervision, in your annual appraisal?
Well, they had a very it was just a big family, and these were also very hardcore lesbians. Jean and Rose, they would just self-describe bull dykes, and they would just be like, "Yeah, your boy's gay." It was, just came up, and yeah, they knew, but it was most disappointing that my mother said some of the things that she said. But it wasn't until years later that I figured out why she said them. I had a cousin who moved from Toronto to Vancouver, which for everyone's perspective is a 5-hour flight, to get away from his family so that he could come out. Subsequently contracted HIV. Because it was he moved in the 1970s. He came out officially to his family the couple of years before he died. And he had to come out as gay and as living with HIV. And this was 2004. So he came out to them about 2002. And my mother did, and everybody knew.
Yeah.
Everyone knew Peter was gay. And my mother was determined, or my mother was afraid that I would be Peter, that I would move away and I would never speak to her, and she didn't want that, and she was really afraid. She quickly came around, like in a matter of days, she came around, but she was acting from a place of real pain, and of course didn't realize the impact of her words.
Yeah. And this is me making assumptions and potentially projections. You had a closer relationship with your mother.
Oh, yes. I was a mama's boy. Beyond the typical, I had zero interest in sports. I didn't like to get dirty. I loved being in the kitchen, cooking with mommy. I loved dress up. I loved playing house. My parents desperately tried to put me in sports. It was so sweet, but everyone was a total disaster. And
What was the worst? What was the biggest disaster?
Soccer.
Oh, okay.
Footy, yeah.
But there's no contact.
It wasn't that. It was the outfit. It was yellow and black.
It wasn't fabulous enough?
I looked like a bumblebee. And I, at probably 7 or 8, keeping in mind that's how old I would have been, I was like, I don't like my outfit. And then they were surprised that I was gay. Yeah, that was bad. Go-karts. My father tried to get me to drive go-karts. Ugh, no.
But that's fun.
Didn't like driving then, don't like driving now. My husband does all the driving. Nothing clicked from a sports perspective. Which also, my father wasn't exactly interested in sports either. So
Yeah. It's not necessarily a sign of anything.
it's not a sign of anything. It's not like heterosexuals all like sports.
Mm-hmm.
But they tried as they might. I wasn't gonna be the round peg.
Okay, so before we move on from this conversation, I just want to give props to your dad for throwing your mum under the bus when he asked you if you were gay.
He did too. He totally did.
I don't think this, of course, but your mum thinks that you might be gay. Are you gay?
Worse, when I told him, he said, well, you're going to have to tell your mom. You prick, I just told you. You tell her. Come on. Yeah.
Oh, but it's kind of nice that you got that opportunity to tell. No, probably not.
I have no regrets. I'm so close with my family. My mother and I were very close until she passed a couple years ago. My father and I are still very close. They treat my husband like their own son. So while at the time, and again, perspective, 1980s, the HIV/AIDS crisis was just kicking into gear, and we as a community were being vilified and hated. They did pretty good, considering.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to find out more about your experiences with Church Street. Do you remember plucking up the courage to go there for the very first time?
I'm laughing because there's a story of my first time on Church Street. So I went to a private boys' school, a boarding school, about an hour outside of Toronto. And
wait.
yes, my parents.
Was there lots of sex there?
Oh, tons.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. I probably had more sex in high school than I did in uni.
Wow. Okay.
Well, you put 400 boys in dormitories, all of them going through puberty, no girls around. Repression happens. Boys need to do what boys need to do. And I was very popular.
Yeah, but I just... It's a world I'll never know. I just have to accept
There's
that.
another story.
Okay,
So a friend of mine who was a graduate of the school was also gay. He's the first person I came out to. And he called me one day, and his boyfriend had taken the train from Montreal to Toronto and didn't speak a lick of English. And he was at this bar on Church Street. And would I go with him to see Yannick? So he shows up at my door in the middle of the night. Well, in the middle of the night. It was probably 9 o'clock, maybe 10 o'clock.
I'm ready for bed by then. Yeah, middle of the night.
And we're, boys' school. We're supposed to be in our rooms at the time. Anyway, picked me up, drove me to Toronto, which is about an hour and a bit. And that was my first time on Church Street, was at 16 years old, a couple minutes below the drinking age. And I wore, because I was going out to a bar, so I had to dress up, I wore a white Mex turtleneck, a blue brushed wool blazer, and khakis to a gay bar in 1987. I think back and I think, oh my gosh, where did I think I was going? And the doorman, I had a fake ID, and the doorman looked at me and just laughed. He looked at my ID and he just laughed. But he let me in. He was like, "Oh my God, go in. It's fine." And that was my first exposure to this world of Church Street.
That's kind of nice then, because there's no overthinking, planning. It's just like, do you want to go? You've got like an hour to get ready. Let's go.
Yeah. It was probably the best way for me to be introduced to that world, because I trusted Jim and I had confidence that he would take care of me.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't have a lot of time to think about it and debate. And I got to go to a couple gay bars and experience them, and then drive back to Port Hope in the middle of the night with his drunk French-speaking boyfriend in the car. And
well, okay, so let's not leave the gay bar. Let's stay in the gay bar for the time being.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
other than thinking to yourself, oh, I might be a little bit overdressed, what are the memories of being there in that space for the first time?
Terrified, but also incredibly excited, because everywhere I looked, there was another man who, assumably, was emotionally and sexually attracted to other men.
At least one of those two things.
Right, yes. There were older guys and younger guys. There were guys in leather. There were guys in jeans. There were guys that were a little more dressed up. There were men of different races and ethnicities. And it was very titillating is the word I'm going to use. And I don't use that word often, but it was very titillating. Like, I was just giddy that I was in a space where no one was going to insult me. No one was going to call me fag. It was a safe space, and it was an incredible feeling.
And what is 16-year-old Michael like in terms of bravery in a space like that?
Horrible. I am a wallflower.
Good.
I am, I have some social anxiety. And so I kind of stood around against a wall. I remember there was this shelf around the edge of the entire bar, so you could rest your drinks.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of pushed myself against the wall and stood there and watched everything kind of happening as my friend Jim was desperately trying to find Yannick, running around the bar hither and yon, trying to find him. And I was just taking it all in. I don't think I remember speaking to anybody.
Were you taking it in the way that I used to take it in? So you've just reminded me of this. I'm going to start talking about myself. Yeah. Sorry, like just a bit of a detour. Where I was petrified of talking to people, of putting myself out there, of facing potential rejection. So I would stand somewhere, like usually against a wall, because then, you know, you're protected by the wall. There's no one going to come from behind you. And hope that by looking moody and quiet, someone would see the potential in me and scoop me up.
No, I would say that I was just in shock more than anything. And so standing there was my brain's way of kind of processing where I was and what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
I was 16 years old and living at a boarding school. There was no hookup happening. There was no scooping me up, and there was no way to reach me, right? So this was, it was really just about kind of experiencing it. And I think my psyche was just like, okay, we're on overload. So we're just going to try to process everything that is happening around us. And there's, you know, music playing, and there's a dance floor, and
the smell,
you know, yeah. Oh, and the other thing, I forgot this part. I asked for a Coors Light. It was the only beer I could remember. And for your listeners who don't know their history, and they should just Google this, Coors Light was not sold in any gay bars up until the late 1990s, because the head of Coors was a horrible human being who try to root out homosexuals in his midst. Anyway, I asked for Coors Light, and the bartender, he just looked at me and said, "We don't sell that shit here." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And I saw another beer and I said, "I'll have one of those." I didn't know what I was ordering. I was 16, right? This is...
Oh, yeah. Just anything. If you let me get away with it, then I'll have it.
Yeah. And I forget what beer it was that I had, but that was, there were these slip-up moments. Feeling like such a fraud. I'm 16, I'm in a bar, so I pushed myself into the corner and just took it all in.
Okay, so let's fast forward now to the next day. So you've found the Montrealer. You found the Montrealer. You've got in the car, you've gone back to school. The next day... how is your world different?
So I will tell you a story and you can edit it out should you wish.
Well, no, I won't.
So Yannick, again, zero English, needs place to stay. Jim, friend, is living at home with his parents. They lived a couple of miles away from the school. So Yannick stays in my room. So we got back, and
is this where you
I had
tell
sex
me
with Jim's boyfriend.
Okay, this is where you tell me he doesn't speak English, but he speaks the language of love. Yeah,
he does. Yeah. He spoke it quite well. And this wasn't the first man I had been with, but it was the first person who was open about their sexuality and identified as part of the queer community. And it wasn't, repressed sex because I needed to get off. It was... I enjoy this. That was the first time that I had a sexual experience that was really positive.
And was it the first time you completely ruined a friendship?
Oh, no. Jim and I stayed friends for decades. We're still friends to this day.
Oh, okay. Hi, Jim.
Yannick was never seen again. I don't know what happened to him. And Jim and he, I'm going to put boyfriend in quotes. Jim and he had met in a bar in Montreal, had sex, and then, hadn't seen each other. And then Yannick was coming to Toronto and Jim got all giddy. How I felt the next day was like a cloud had been lifted from me. Like I had acknowledged who I was, and this wet blanket of life was gone. And I felt a bit freer. I felt like it was okay to be me because I wasn't alone. And that had been a feeling that I had felt for a very long time, like I was the only one. I went from knowing one queer person to being in a bar full of queer people. And it really did help me to build some confidence in who I was. Because I didn't feel alone.
Unpack this statement for me. You didn't feel the wet blanket of life.
So prior to that experience, again, keeping in mind that this was pre-internet, pre-cell phones, pre-everything, I felt very alone. The only stories of gay men, and specifically gay men, that you ever heard were about people dying from AIDS.
Yeah.
It's the only thing I ever heard. There were no positive role models. There were no examples of, open sexuality. There were no Stonewall UKs and all these organizations. So I shouldn't say that. There were some of those. But I felt terribly alone trying to figure out who I was and hide it and deny it. And that comes with a lot of weight, psychological weight, where you're just carrying around the shame of being who you are.
So I know, we made a joke before about you having had more sex at school than you did at uni, and that was happening all the time. It's interesting to hear you say that you feel alone because you were, and I'm going to use words now that might not directly map onto your experience, so correct me if I'm wrong, but you were having these intimate moments with fellow students, you were connecting with them sexually, but it sounds as though you still felt very other, and that the experience that you were having was not one that they were also having.
Absolutely.
How did you know that then?
Well, it was pretty obvious for I would say for most, if not all, of the fellow students that I had sex with. And it was not a small number. There were quite, I'm not bragging, I'm just saying it was quite common.
So ballpark, like 79? How many?
No, I mean, girl, I'm not that much of a whore. I
have different
a couple
standards,
dozen.
Obviously. A couple of dozen, okay, yeah.
A couple of dozen in a school of 400.
Mm-hmm.
I think for all of them, it was simply experimentation and a need to release. And coming back to your question, how I felt that was they were still bullying me. The captain of the hockey team and I had sex for 6 months, which tells me that he's a big old girl. He's gay. A blowjob once, you're just testing the waters. 6 months where we did everything but actually sleep in the same bed. That was a relationship. He was still, not as much as he did before we started sleeping together, but he was still bullying me and not defending me when others would bully me. So that's how I felt othered. And I wasn't out.
What a mind fuck.
But everyone knew.
Yeah.
They assumed, and they assumed correctly.
I'm sorry that happened.
I don't think of it in those terms. I'm a Buddhist and believe that everything happens in your life for a reason, and you're meant to experience those things. And I believe that I needed to go through the struggles that I did to make me the person that I am today, who fights for the rights of queer people on a daily basis.
Yes, but it's still shit. Like, it's
It's absolutely shit.
I can imagine that fucked you up in terms of relationships for a while.
Oh, decades. And then I spent most of the 90s high. Had a little trip to detox. I blame my drug addiction on my experiences in high school. So I'm not saying it was all rosy. I'm saying that at 54, nearly 40 years later, I can look at that, I can reflect on those years and not feel as much pain about them as I did at the time.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm probably not going to have an argument with the Buddhist about this.
If I could go back in time and not go through it, 100%, I would do that. I can't. It is what it is. I experienced a lot of really horrible things, and I am who I am today because of them.
Yeah.
The good and the bad.
Yeah. Okay, so why don't we go back to Church Street?
Yes.
We haven't actually really talked about the steps at all, which
we haven't.
Standard. So if you've listened to the show before, you'll know that. Anyway, so you've been to the clubs there. You've seen the scene. Do you remember first learning about the steps?
I'm trying to think. So I learned about the steps after uni. So the whole gym experience and chaps and comrades, the bars, Yannick, was pre-uni. I then go away to uni. I come back.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing I did when I came back on a Thursday or Friday night was went to that same bar, because I had no friends in Toronto, and I certainly had no queer friends in Toronto.
So where had you been away for university, and was there like no queer scene there?
Well, no, it wasn't that there wasn't a queer scene there. In fact, I was active, shall we say, in the queer scene in Victoria, British Columbia. Mm-hmm. I went to the University of Victoria. But in going back to Toronto, where I had no sense of community, I went to Chaps, and they had a drag show, and Miss Jackie Baker adopted me. She saw me in the crowd, and she immediately was like, you are mine now, and introduced me to all her friends. And I overnight suddenly had a community of friends in the city of Toronto, all young, queer men mostly, or at least, male identifying. And they took me, because I had only ever seen this tiny section where there were two bars side by side. And they were like, oh, we need to go to Church Street. And so we went down to Church Street, and they told me about the steps, and they showed me where the other bars were and where the shops were. And they exposed me to this world that I didn't know existed.
And was that it then? Like, just you show up, you get adopted, you've got a group of friends instantly.
Pretty much.
Oh, wow.
I was young and pretty, and, I would say that the community was very, I'm trying to think of the word, like cliquey is the word that comes to mind, where, the younger little gay boys all hung out together, and the lesbians hung out together, and the older gay guys and the bears and the leather community. And right, there are these tribes that exist within the community still to this day, but they were even more divided then. And so I fell in with the young queens who liked drag scene, and really got to know the community through their eyes. Subsequently, I got involved with a group called the Lesbian and Gay Youth of Toronto, which LGYT, yep.
Oh, that's not an exciting acronym.
It's terrible, yeah. And before the invention of the bis and the trans people. And I got involved with this youth group. I'm in my early 20s, and I'm just trying to sort of figure my way in the world and figure out what I'm going to do with my life. And so, again, I really started to embed myself in the community. And Church Street became my home. I actually moved. My first apartment was on Church Street.
Oh, God. I mean, that sounds exciting, but also sounds hellish.
Well, yeah, it does sound exciting. And for the first little while, it's really exciting because you can walk out your door and you're 10 feet from a bar. You can get laid when someone passes you on the street. It's all very exciting. And then it just becomes toxic because it's all around you all the time and you can't escape it. There's nothing real about living like that. I didn't realize that for a long time. It took me a while to get out of that.
Well, I hope you enjoyed it but maybe before it slipped into toxicity, maybe during as well.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed it. I think there's so much trauma in our community, and that trauma just sort of permeates the fiber of the community, or it certainly did at the time. And I didn't have enough self-awareness to see that happening.
What do you mean by that? That the behaviors between people within the community reinforce that trauma?
Yeah. People are all working through their trauma independent of one another and acting out towards one another. Okay. So, there's a lot of bitchiness in the community where people are quite cruel to one another, even when they're supposed to be friends. And the reality is that's just people working through their trauma. They're working through their shitty relationship with their family, or they're just bitches. But oftentimes, it's really that they are.
It's probably
there's
such a high propensity of it. We can't just say they're all bitches, right?
There's something a little deeper.
Yeah,
and the people working through the psychological damage that we have as human beings, let alone as queer people in the 1980s. It was not a healthy environment. So you put. If I can draw you a picture here, you put me with all of my baggage and my crap about my identity, having been bullied for, at that point, almost my entire life. You put me into an environment where people are drinking, they're doing drugs, they are working through their own trauma. And I just fell into that environment. And what I really needed was therapy. And I didn't get it until after I had, done some serious damage to my brain. But, yeah, it was just a bit of a toxic mess.
And sex with strangers is cheaper than therapy as well.
It really is.
Yeah.
It's much cheaper and more fun.
Yeah. Don't know. Jury's out on that. I think it depends on the
I've had a
particular
lot of sex with strangers and I've had a lot of therapy. I can tell you, one's more fun than the other.
Okay, well, I won't argue with you. So, the steps.
Yes.
Is this a place that you meet people before going out? Is this a place that you go after going out? Is it both?
Both. You know, as you were talking there, what came to mind was a really comfortable couch that you'd go and hang out and you'd talk with friends and you'd meet new friends. And sometimes you did that before the bars. Sometimes you did that after the bars because, of course, the bars at the time closed at 1 a.m. And the coffee shop was open until some ungodly hour. And you'd go and you'd hang out. And it was just that centerpiece of the community where you could be, and you'd see so many different people, like all walks of life would be hanging out on the steps. And there'd be little dramas happening and all sorts of goodness. I think it gave the community a centerpiece that it lacks today.
Mm-hmm.
As the steps are gone.
And so you said that it kind of became the hub of the community and it was where everyone went.
Yeah.
Like, what do you think the conditions were that enabled that to happen?
That's a good question. I think in part it was the coffee shop.
Mm-hmm.
And that cafe, coffee shop becoming the center of a community that still exists today. You know, it was a place to go and get something to drink and something to eat. And that made it a part of it. But it also was essentially like a patio for the coffee shop, which they didn't have in that instance. It was also right at a major intersection. And so there was a lot of foot traffic. I think that was part of it. It was also in an environment where the entire, except for one bar, everything was in the queer community was within a city square block. Mm-hmm. So bars, community center, apartment buildings, stores, all within this, bathhouses, all within this confined area. And the steps was at the very center of it all. There was kind of equal space north and south, east and west. And the steps were at the center of everything.
Smack dab in the middle.
Yeah.
What happened to the steps?
Yeah, so the building is still there. The steps are still there, but the building management to get rid of people who are street engaged and drug users, etc., they actually built the stores out to take over the steps. So the steps are still there to get into the stores, but they're now quite, narrow, and there isn't that place to hang out in the same way that existed before. I also think we stopped needing the steps. With the advent of smartphones, the internet, I don't need the steps to connect with people and make friends and find sex. So people started migrating away from the community.
Is it that we don't need it, or is it that we think we don't need it?
Oh, it's the latter.
Okay.
I mean, we think we don't need it because we simply have a device in our hand that we can pull out and go, oh, here's a guy. Mm-hmm. I think what we lack is healthy, intimate relationships. We lack the ability to make friends. Grindr, Scruff, all of these apps are not, they're falsely creating intimacy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if I would even use the word intimacy to describe any interactions I have on Grindr, but it's the fact that you don't have those repeated interactions with people without the expectation that something will happen. Which, just doesn't happen anymore.
It's purposeful interaction versus going to a bar and meeting someone and just finding a friend.
Yeah.
Those things don't necessarily happen in the same manner that they did 40 years ago. Some will say that's evolution, and I don't disagree with that. But I do think that we as a community lack that centerpiece because we have gotten so integrated into society. I mean, gay bars are dying a painful death because people can go to their local pub that isn't necessarily targeting the queer community, and they don't need to go to a church street. They can just go wherever they like.
So then you might have already answered this, but what do you think Toronto has lost in losing the steps?
Heart. It's lost heart. People still go to Church Street as a destination. On a Friday or Saturday night, Church Street will be teeming with people going to the bars and having dinner. There's lots of great restaurants there, and there's still bathhouses there, but it doesn't feel like it has that sense of heart, of the center that everything runs through. That building is just another building on Church Street. The coffee shop is gone. It moved actually down next door. The bank is still there. The photo shop is now a restaurant. I think it's a Thai restaurant. It just lacks that centerpiece, that heart.
And focusing on you for the next few questions, what do you think having access to that space, what do you think it taught you about yourself?
I think it taught me to be proud of being a queer person. It taught me my values, that I wanted to work in a world where I could advocate for queer people, which is what I do for a living today. It was a safe place in some really formative years. I feel safest and most comfortable when I am surrounded by people from the queer community because of decades of bullying and discrimination that has left my psyche pretty damaged. Now, I've been through a ton of therapy and I'm in a great place, but there is always in the back of my head this question about whether or not I'm in a safe environment. And my husband and I have subsequently moved to Palm Springs, California, less than a year ago. And we chose here because half of the population are members of the community. So I feel safe when I'm in Palm Springs. When I leave Palm Springs, I lack that feeling of safety. And I would say that that's what the steps gave me at a really critical time in my life, was that sense of safety.
Okay. So was there anything else to talk about in regards to the steps?
I don't think so. I just would say I miss them.
And also, because it was Canada, could you only use the steps for like 3 months of the year?
That's not entirely inaccurate, but no, there would be people out on the steps year round.
Wow.
Yeah. Again, it was the heart of the community.
Yeah, but like how many queer Torontonians have piles?
Have piles?
Hemorrhoids from sitting on cold.
I was going to say, is that what you mean, hemorrhoids?
Yeah.
Well, I've never done a count.
The numbers must be astounding.
I'm sure many. Yeah. It's a very cold country at times. No, hemorrhoids. There's a way to end the podcast on hemorrhoids.
Probably shouldn't have asked that question, but I had it drilled into me from a very young age never to sit on cold concrete, and served me well because I've never gotten piles. probably too much information. I'm sorry. Anyway, if you enjoyed this conversation, if you had a great time this week and you want to find out more about Michael, then do go and follow him on Instagram at the Michael Bach. You can also visit his website, which is michaelbach.com. Whilst you are surfing the wild, wild web, I sound very old when I say that, then why not find me on Instagram and TikTok at Lost Spaces Pod. Okay, well, that's us for another week. Thank you again for joining me in these conversations. It really means a lot. It's really weird as well to think that you're out there listening to this and I don't even know who you are. It's kind of cool, kind of weird. I should just go now, shouldn't I? Right, okay, bye. I'll see you next week.